Hello, and welcome to the third session in our members-only series, The Impact of Information Governance Compliance on Cybersecurity and Privacy Risk. My name is Heather Lehman, and I work for ARMA International in our membership department. We do have a few ARMA announcements today before we get started. There we go. InfoCon, ARMA InfoCon is coming live and in person, and we cannot wait to see you all in Houston. And with just over 60 education sessions, 5 keynotes, several networking events, it's going to be great. Those of you who can't travel, we do have a virtual option, and you can check out all of that information and details on arma.org. Also, we have our next webinar this month, June 17th. OMG, yes, retention management ROI is attainable. So make sure and join us for that as well. And for our fourth installment of our members-only webinar, it is scheduled for September 2nd. So make sure to keep a lookout on our website for more details on that. A few housekeeping items for today as well. Please use the Q&A box to ask any questions of our panelists. That way everybody can see it. And also, just to answer this question before we get started, yes, we will provide a link to the slides and the recording after the webinar is finished. So you'll get those by email in the next couple of days. But before we get started here today, I do want to make sure that we thank our partner, Rico, because their support, we are able to bring this programming to you like this. When you're considering new products and services, we hope you consider our partners who support you. So I'm going to hand it over to Eric Parrish of Rico for just a few moments.
All right. Thank you, Heather. I appreciate it. Now, of course, I realize that I'm holding up the real presentation here, so I will be quick. Happy to support ARMA. And as mentioned, I am Eric Parrish with Rico. I am on the information governance team based outside of Seattle. Now, my team and I help organizations better manage their data and information with the primary goal to help you become more proactive in managing your information footprint. And of course, there's a variety of ways that we can do that. And the biggest picture, top level where we help clients, is coming in with a maturity assessment with our principal consultants who are former practitioners, looking at your system and showing you where you're strong, where you're weak, and making recommendations. But where they're different is that they will also help you implement. They won't just drop a report and say, good luck with that. They will help with run your IG committee meetings, setting agenda, all the way down to helping getting in the weeds to craft policies for particular types of data. And they are technology agnostic. I know that's a big point that people ask about, are they going to push new technology on us? And the answer is no. They'll look at what you are using and try to come up with new ways to use what you already have rather than a knee-jerk reaction to buy new stuff. Of course, you don't always need that high of a level of support. Sometimes it's just a one-off or a few tweaks. For instance, maybe you've got a data silo where you've got some privacy concerns and you want to clean it up. We can come in and help you with file analysis. We're working with the university right now with their records team with lease abstraction. So that's a very finite project, a start and finish that it'll be done with. And we can help with litigation readiness. And we have a full suite of e-discovery tools should you ever have to journey over to that side of the IG reference model when the complaint lands on your desk. Of course, I can chat on for a very long time about all of this, so I will stop here, but my information is on the screen if you'd like have additional questions or would like more information. And of course, again, happy to be supporting ARMA. And so back to you, Heather. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you for your support here today. So now let's get down to it. I want to take a moment and thank our panelists for being here today. Your commitment to our community is very much appreciated. First, we have Andrea D'Ambra. Andrea is the head of e-discovery and information governance for Norton Rose Fulbright, as well as Laura Hunt, who is counsel with Norton Rose Fulbright, and Ellen Blanchard, who's the director of discovery and information governance for T-Mobile. I'm going to hand it over to you now, Andrea. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having us. We're really delighted to be able to come and talk to you about what we think is a pretty interesting topic, and hopefully you'll agree with us. Yeah, Laura, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are, everyone. Thanks so much for having us. So today we're really going to talk about, some practical advice and tips that we've seen and our experiences in really thinking about how to manage your cybersecurity risk from a breach, but keeping in mind the information governance component. And, you know, as Heather introduced us, you know, Andrea and I work on many cyber incidents, and Ellen is the head of, the director, excuse me, of Discovery and Information Governance at T-Mobile. So she's really seen this from the inside of a very large company. And we just want to share some of our experiences in handling InfoGov and really managing that cyber risk. We're going to walk through a few different topics, and we hope to keep this as practical as possible. And we do want to hear questions from you. We're going to walk through, you know, some of the things that we've been seeing, what kinds of incidents we've encountered, what are really the risks when a cyber incident occurs. And then how do we minimize the damage of a cyber incident through really good, proper information governance hygiene. And then finally, we know the key component to this is really how do we get management's buy-in to really invest both money and personnel into creating a really strong information governance policy, not only, you know, for the functioning of the business, but also to make sure that we're managing that cyber risk. So with that, we'll start with, and I hope everyone can see my screen, okay?
Yep.
We wanted to start with, and we won't take too long on this particular study. And of course, we don't endorse any particular vendor or service, but we did find that this study was really interesting. It's a study by IBM that came out in July. It was a study across 500 organizations that had experienced a data breach within the last year across 17 different countries. So it's a really, you know, kind of broad study. And we wanted to share some of the key findings because it's a good kind of framework for how we're going to discuss this session. Some of the things that IBM found, and you'll see here that, you know, the average cost of the data breach was almost $4 million in 2020, and that's across the globe. Healthcare was really the hardest hit industry. It costs approximately $150 per document for customer that had customer PII. And then also the US had the highest average data breach cost at $8.64 million. So those were really some of the key findings. Thinking through or digging through another, you know, piece of some of the findings, IBM found that the key causes were compromised credentials and cloud misconfiguration at about 19%. So very interesting, both of course, very much linked to information governance. Two, the cost of the data breach, really it's the lost business costs were the largest share of the average cost, and loss of customer PII was the most costly for businesses. And we're gonna walk through some of our experiences with how to reduce costs when it comes to a data breach. But one of the key findings, and we're going to talk about tabletops, was that there were $2 million saved when companies had a very active incident response and also tabletop exercise. So with that, it looks like there was a question, Andrea?
Yeah, there was a question about how many countries this particular study was done across. Was it 17?
Yes, 17 countries.
Yeah, and I just wanted to comment on this because this was done in July of 2020. It really sort of was at the very cusp of when this ransomware wave started, right? Yeah. And you know, we started personally seeing, you know, these really massive ransomware attacks starting in like April, May. Yeah. The ones that we were handling in July, the ransoms were, you know, I think they were asking about 5 million. They were getting maybe 600,000, somewhere in there. In February, so February 2021, that has changed dramatically. So this average cost has actually gone up dramatically. The ransoms that are being asked are in the 60 million, 50 million, $40 million. And they're, we've heard of some in the news of as much as 40 million. They're paying out a lot on these. So I think these numbers are helpful, but we should all know that the complexion of this has really changed since this report has been out there. And you said, why do you see as the reason why so somebody asked, what do you see as the reason why the US has the highest country average cost? I think part of that is that we have 50 states that have different data breach laws. And so, the compliance with that is difficult. Laura, Ellen, thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I think it's probably very much the compliance framework within the US that definitely contributes.
Yeah, and I don't know if the legal fees play into the cost as well in that report, but absolutely, kind of just the cost of litigation and discovery in the US is much higher than in other parts of the world. And so that's going to drive up the costs as well. But it's important to consider, right? I mean, that is absolutely part of the cost and the risk that companies need to evaluate in this context.
Yeah, and you're much more likely to get sued in the US than over in Europe, at least as far as I've seen, or in Asia. I love this. I love these questions. It would be good if the US had its own version of GDPR. Many of us agree with you.
Yes, just one standard across the country would be great.
It was challenging when it was just California, and now that the other states are coming on board, it's it definitely makes this really challenging.
Yeah. Well, with that, we'll kind of move to what we've been seeing, and Andrea's kind of shared some thoughts on the different kinds of cyber incidents that we've been seeing. But I don't know, Ellen, if you have, if you've seen any sort of trends in the cyber incidents or anything to really share there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say, so prior to T-Mobile, I spent a lot of time with both at a tech company and then also in private practice. So a lot of my experience is not just T-Mobile. So this is my personal opinions on this, but and from a wide variety. But yeah, I mean, I think, Andrea mentioned the biggest ones, obviously with the ransomware being an issue, but then, we're seeing a lot of more activity on the kind of dark web related to these things. And so, issues with credentials and, multi-factor authentication is in place, but it's not always enforced. And so there's a lot of potential opportunities for, people to get access to those credentials and things like that as well.
Yeah, I think in general, we're seeing, there's been this massive rise in ransomware. Part of that is due to the fact that, 3-4 years ago when ransomware was out there, it would lock down your system and encrypt it, but that was it. So you were sort of left with the decision of whether to pull out your backup tapes or give over the ransom money. But now the threat actors, being very smart, have come up with this idea that, we're going to steal your data, and then if you don't pay the ransom, we're going to post it on the dark web for anybody to see it on our shame site. And they do. Yeah. We certainly have had clients who've decided not to pay the ransom, and a large part of their data is then put up on the web for everybody to troll through. So that has turned out to be very effective for them as far as influencing the decision to pay a ransom. The other thing we're seeing is business email compromises. So, somebody getting credentials for email and then going in and sending out emails saying, hey, please pay, this vendor $700,000, got to get it done immediately. Let's go. That sort of thing. Things like that. Laura, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that definitely covers some of the risks as well, where it's, not only are threat actors locking down data or encrypting it and requiring ransom just for the companies to access it, but it's also that public, the exfiltration, the stealing of the data and posting it elsewhere can be really, really detrimental to companies. And so, I think that those are some of the risks when it comes to cyber incidents, and, kind of moving into, okay, once that's happened, what are some of the impacts on companies? And maybe I'll start with Ellen, and then Andrew, if you want to share any thoughts there.
Yeah. Well, and this is a little bit goes to the question around the cost, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the impact is really, the sort of regulatory investigations, and here in the US, we've got, it isn't just California anymore. It's, a number of other state agencies that are looking at this and have privacy laws. Even though there isn't a federal privacy act, there are still federal agencies that take this very, very seriously. And so, and the process for fixing this, right? If there is an issue, it can slow down your business. It can shut, you may have to shut things off temporarily while you're investigating or fixing, access issues and things like that. And so there can be costs, there to the business. And then, it's a huge reputational harm, right? I mean, yes, there's a downstream impact to the customers, if their information's lost and things like that. And it's hugely, time consuming if, your identity has been taken. And so there really is this sense, kind of like a loss of trust, and really kind of feeling like the company let you down. And so many companies are really relying on their customers and their, kind of goodwill of the customers to buy their products or shop in their stores, right? And Target and things like that. That cost is huge and hard to quantify.
Yeah, and I would say, I had this conversation with a client who's B2B, and we were talking about cyber risk, and he was like, we just have to worry about employees, we don't have to worry about those consumers. And I said to him, well, but what about your business customers that you do business with every day? They might be really angry that their personal information out there is, on the web. So it really can affect you, regardless of whether you're just dealing with customers, regardless of whether, there's employee data. There may be the data of your bigger corporate customers that's out there, and that can greatly affect your business. We have a client right now who has some very big accounts with some very big companies. And if they were to lose that business, it would be a huge chunk of revenue taken out. So there, you have to handle the discussions about the breach very carefully. But if you had gotten rid of the data when you were supposed to, then maybe that wouldn't be such a big deal. The other thing is regulatory stuff. We see more and more regulators are really starting to get involved and ask questions, and maybe some uncomfortable questions about data and what you're doing, and why you've kept it for so long, particularly in the EU. But also the FTC has come out and said, you shouldn't be keeping information beyond its business use. So.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points, and just from those alone, there's lots of different impacts on the company. I think another impact could, and we kind of referenced it earlier, is the potential for class action lawsuits. If they're not only could federal and state regulators, you could be subject to fines and further fees, just for investigations to respond. But also, eventually you could be hit with a class action lawsuit, which can be extremely expensive. even if it does get thrown out at the motion to dismiss phase.
Yeah, and
So,
sorry.
no, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the participants just posted a thing saying or reminding us that, you know, if you're a healthcare company and you have a breach that's has more than 500 people affected, under HIPAA, you have to publicly announce it. And that can be really difficult for some clients to handle. I will say, the one thing I will say about all this is that I don't think these breaches are as harmful to reputation as they used to be. You know, in the Target time, in the Experian time, when, you know, a massive data breach was sort of unusual. But today we're hearing about them every day, right? So when we go to our clients' customers and talk to them about, you know, there was a breach, there's more sort of a, well, did you do this? Did you do this? Okay, fine, you know. So that it's not good news for many reasons, but it is a little bit, it makes it a little bit easier.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that there's the recognition that so many companies are in this boat, that it's less about, did you have one, and more about, you know, did you take the right steps? And there's not a clear checklist of what those steps are, but like, were you at least reasonable, and did you give it thought and things like that? And that's going to go a long way, I think, with a lot of customers, although it definitely is different in the B versus the kind of general public context, because I do think that with the individual customers, they're not hearing as often about those breaches happening all the time, and may, you know, still have some of those concerns. But yeah, it's not as shocking as the Target one was.
Yeah, I agree. It seems, you know, as they're becoming more common, when customers are notified, they are asking those questions about, you know, okay, well, what of my data was actually impacted, and kind of going into thinking about this from an IG lens. If you know what you have and what your what is in a particular folder, what's in a particular directory, you'll be in a much better position at the outset, if God forbid you get hit with a cyber incident, to say, okay, typically these are the kinds of files that we keep in this particular directory, rather than having to spend a lot of time to actually, you know, conduct a review before you determine what's actually in those directories. So I think that's a good transition, you know, into, okay, so we know that cyber incidents can really have a significant negative impact on companies, but we want to give share some of our experiences on how to minimize that risk. Really starting with, you know, how do you balance preserving data, right? You may have to preserve it for regulatory reasons, or maybe you have a pending litigation or government investigation, with making sure that you are defensively disposing of data when it's time, right? If there's no other legal obligation. So what are some of the considerations? And I think I'll throw it to Ellen first, and then have Andrea add some additional comments there of how do you really strike that balance?
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is being proactive. You were just kind of mentioning, you know, the fact is knowing what data you have is really important and goes a long way to understanding kind of, you know, and how does that particular data fit into what's required to be kept, right? And whether that's specific statutes that lay out how long something has to be kept, or, you know, whether it's needed from a statute of limitations requirements in connection with a litigation that might happen or might arise out of it, and the company needs that to, you know, for its own information related to that litigation. And then there's the business interest, right? How long does the business really need to keep this? But I think part of this is the biggest thing is education, and both that's education of what's there and also education of the business as to why this is important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, you talked a lot about reasonable steps and how, you know, what we should be doing is reasonable. There was a question that was posted about, is there a metric to further specify what a healthy information governance program looks like? Is it based on a scale of maturity? At what level can an organization say we're now safer from cyber threats? I think it is a scale of maturity. That's how I've seen it sort of discussed, and everybody's sort of on the path, right? But I do think if you have a healthy program and you can say that you are disposing of data at the appropriate time, that limits your risk significantly. Mm-hmm. We have a client right now who has data back to 1998 in the EU, and they have no real good reason for it. They just never threw it out. They didn't think about it, right? And that is a huge risk for them, not just because they have to notify more people, right? And these people that haven't worked with the company for 20 years, but in addition, these customers are asking, and these former employees and stuff are asking, well, why did you have our data this long? And they could go to the regulator and complain about that. So yeah, I don't think there's any perfect answer there, but I do think that the closer you can get to a very mature IG project, the better. Let's see, there's also a question about how do we get a nonprofit org on board with privacy when they think it won't happen to them or it's happening to everybody? We have had data breaches with nonprofits, and it is a freaking nightmare for them because, of course, they are relying on donations and corporate sponsorships. And, if they're suffering a breach, it can be very detrimental. As far as what to say, I mean, I think you should maybe go out and find some of those nonprofit breaches, because they do report them upon occasion. That's usually what gets people's attention. Talking about the Experian thing, talking about Sony, those sorts of cases where there was a lot of embarrassment. Oftentimes we'll get a board to sort of stand up and take listen. Any thoughts on that, ladies?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think some of this goes back to the understanding what information the privacy or the nonprofit has that could be breached, right? I think some of this is, a lot of times the boards, even in those nonprofits, are removed from some of the day-to-day aspects of what's going on. So they may not be thinking about the fact that, we get, when donors give us money, we get financial information about them. And so that's sitting in databases, right? So a lot of this is taking that concrete information about what's there. And then especially, with a nonprofit, you are so reliant on people supporting the organization. And so that reputational harm is, a big factor as well. And so I think those two pieces combined is a great way to go to the board. And definitely, as Andrea mentioned, showing that this has happened and it can happen, and they are no different than, a corporation to the extent that they have the same type of information. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. And, on the part about, well, it's happening to everyone, so, why should we worry? Yeah, I mean, that's one of the fundamental tenets of cybersecurity is that, if a hacker wants to get into your particular place, they're going to get in, right? There's no, they can come at it in so many different ways that eventually, if they really want to get in, they're going to get in. So that's why it's almost even more important to make sure that whatever things you have in place are reasonable, because it's almost an inevitability. Yeah. Laura, would you?
A long way to like it's a reasonable standard, right? And so to take the position, as Andrea said, that this isn't going to happen to you is just not reasonable anymore. And so what you're trying to do, and you should do things, I mean, you should absolutely do as much as you can to kind of fortify the walls, right, around that protection. And you can't just say, well, it's going to happen, so I'm going to throw up my arms. You can't do that. But there's two pieces to this. There's the, how can we fortify those walls so that, you know, most people aren't going to come in. And it's also about making sure that if they do get in, that what they're getting at is, you know, defensible as to why you had it, and that you've taken steps to get rid of what you don't need, and you're not collecting extraneous information, you know, that you don't need, and those types of things. So it, you know, it's those two pieces, you know, to that, and understanding what it is, you know, making sure that you're really kind of thinking through both sides of it, and not that it's never going to happen, but just that, you know, you're trying to take those right steps.
Yeah, you want to have a good story to tell to your insurer. You want to have a good story to tell to your customer. You know, when people are asking you questions like, you know, do you use multi-factor authentication? And you're like, not yet. That's not a good story to tell, right? And while people, you know, because they're in the news so much, you know, people aren't as upset about it. They do get really upset about it if you're not doing those things that are just sort of basic security stuff. What do you think, Laura?
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points. And really, you know, to kind of summarize, it's about making sure that you have really good cybersecurity in place, right? IT security. But then too, you know, making sure that you are defensively disposing of anything that you don't, you know, are not required to keep under any kind of, you know, regulatory requirements or litigation duty to preserve, or that you need for the business. And to the extent that, you know, the data falls into any of those categories, making sure that if you have personal data that could trigger, you know, notification requirements or be detrimental to individuals, that you're securing that data, you know, extra specially, right? You're really, like, you may want to password protect, you may want to have, you know, encrypted data, or maybe store that data in a data source where there's an extra wall around it, so that you're still complying with all your preservation obligations, you know, but then also making sure that if a threat actor does get in, it would be very, very difficult for them to breach two walls. And so, you know, kind of on that, you know, when you're thinking about, okay, we're going to lock some of this data away. We've got the sensitive data. We want to make sure that it's protected. Are there any considerations, you know, protecting that data, but still making sure that it's accessible, like, let's say to HR or the people that really need to use it? Are there any, you know, things that you've seen that have been helpful to also strike that balance? And I guess, Andrea, I'll start with you.
All right. Yeah, I mean, it's really important to think about whether your security measures are going to be actually implemented, because at the end of the day, the employees, they want to get their job done, right? And if they have to jump through 15 hoops to get, you know, to the data that they need to get to, they're going to do something to make that data more easily accessible. They're going to copy it somewhere. They're going to do something which really defeats the purpose of the security. So I think, you know, we see all the time these, our clients will come with these data classification policies that have, you know, certain data that's restricted, and, you know, you have to have a secret decoder ring and, you know, sign off by the CEO in order to use that data. And then one of the things they'll put in there is attorney-client privilege documents. And, like, there's attorney-client privilege documents all over the place in an organization, and necessarily so. So, you know, I think that employees are very good at figuring out ways to be efficient, as I'm sure Ellen will confirm.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think there has to be a partnership between kind of legal, the IT, and the business. And you have to understand, I mean, the vast majority, and this is, whether this is, an employee shadow IT, right? And going out and finding a new technology that they're going to use, or storing data in a place that makes it easy for them to access. They're not doing it to put the company at risk. They are doing it to do their jobs and to make, in the best way possible, and make the company as successful as they possibly can. And so the best way to protect this stuff is to say, look, what does the business need to do their job? Let's make sure that we make that easy for them, right? I don't need 12 different conferencing technologies. I need a couple that satisfy the needs. And whether that's transcription because you have, employees who have, certain needs for transcribing that information, right? Or phone calls, or it's, something that works across a number of different countries, like whatever it is, it's understanding what those business needs are. And if I can say, okay, I've got, 3 conferencing tools that work for all employees, or 95% of the employees, and maybe I've got a business unit somewhere that I need a special one, but I've got those 3, I can lock down the security around those applications, right? Or I've got a source and I can put single sign-on around it. So yes, it's providing protection, and we've got, one multi-factor authentication thing on our phone that's really easy to use. People are going to use it, and couple that with education about why they have to do it, right? Because part of them, it's just they don't really know why it matters that they go through the single sign-on. So the education is important, but make it easy for them and they'll do it. It's just when we add, 15 different types of technology, or if you're signing onto this, you need to, authenticate it through this, and sign onto this, I need to authenticate it through that, or I have no way to get information to our outside counsel, even something like that, if it's over a certain size, like that, it's not practical. So then they go out and find other solutions. And that's where you open up these kind of chinks in the wall that you're creating around your data.
Yeah, I agree. And one point to add there, you may be able to, and this can come also into like management buy-in, you may be able to leverage other models that you've used. So, I'm an e-discovery nerd in my heart. And, I've been working on cyber matters more recently, but, there may be an instance or a model that your company has used for e-discovery, for example, like your preservation, your litigation hold policy. What can you, now it's not going to look the same, right, for your access to, personal information, but what can you leverage from what you already have in your company, to this sort of IT security and protecting PII, because that may be, a starting place. And to, Ellen and Andrea's points about the usability of the technology and the usability of the instructions, you may be able to leverage some of your, lit hold instructions to say, okay, how do we model that, and what worked and what didn't work? Because I feel like that's a more, talking about maturity, right? That seems to be a more mature model than maybe this sort of newer, like protecting PII, at least for some companies. So that may be something, to consider. And on that point about, okay, how do we put this into our policies? Are there any, anything that you've seen that's been, effective provisions to put into an information governance policy to kind of mitigate against some of these risks?
Do you want to go first, Ellen, or you want me to?
You go.
I think it's not even so much the policies themselves, although, giving people a policy and a retention schedule that has 2,000, different categories, probably not going to get implemented, right? Too complicated. But so we see a lot of clients going to sort of big bucket approach, but reasonable big bucket approach, so that you're not over keeping things that, you could get rid of earlier just because it's in a particular bucket. But those seem to be better implemented. But the other thing is the training around those policies. And I realize that this is probably one of all our friends who are records managers out there have the most frustration because you don't get as much training opportunities as you'd like. But when you're talking to people about, why they need to be doing records retention and getting rid of stuff, when it's time to get rid of it and remembering to do it, talking about how, if the company were to get breached, this could be an issue, that gives them sort of a tangible thing to be thinking about as to why it's important. Because otherwise, to them, it's, well, it doesn't matter if I keep it another year. I've got like a million things going on. I don't have time to do this, but this is an actual consequence that could affect them and their livelihoods, which tends to get their attention.
And I'll add to, beyond the policies, I'll come back to policies in a minute, but kind of what you're saying is we need ways to automate this. And so, because the reality is that a lot of people don't have time to go through their emails and, flag it. Is this, something I need to keep for 5 years or 10 years, or, oh, I can get rid of this, or this is under hold, for a particular case. And so I need to keep it. And so they just, even if you've got an email policy that says you can only keep it for, 6 months or a year or things like that, they may just dump a whole bunch of stuff into another folder where they can keep it, and you're still in the same boat that they just have lots of emails. So the more we can think about the downstream impact, or how do we automate this, right? You're right, like the 2000 category retention schedule isn't something that a computer, right, or AI can go through and say, okay, I can train a system to say this fits into this category, and this fits into category 500, and this fits into category 2000, and therefore it needs to be kept for X amount of time. But if you can think more broadly about that, then you may be able to actually train AI to help you with that, and in a way that's defensible, right? In a way that you can, it may even be better than relying on individual employees to identify whether a document should be kept for 2 years or 5 years and things like that. But you need to, to think about those downstream. And then I think on the policy, again, it's only as good as what people can follow. So it's wonderful to have, a policy that says I'm only going to keep the, kind of restricted information for 6 months or something like that. But if an employee doesn't have a way to follow that, it's worse than not having that. So I think really being thoughtful about the information governance policies, but also how they fit into other policies. And do you really need all of these policies? Is there a better way to do this and things like that? I think, I don't have a great answer for it, but definitely something that, I know a lot of companies are thinking about is how to make the policies something that people can follow.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And on that point, one thing to consider is doing a pilot with maybe a smaller group of employees. If you're thinking about rolling out a new retention policy, you may want to just see how it goes for 30 or 60 days with a group of employees, maybe across different business units, just to see how does it go, and then you can make some adjustments. And I think really, on the topic of tabletop and making sure that you have a plan in place if an incident were to arise is really, really important. So not only, do you have to have your disposition house in order, but once you get hit with the incident, it's kind of too late, right, to create an incident response plan. So I think it really is a multifaceted approach where you're making sure your retention is in good shape, and you're, what you're going to do if, God forbid, you get hit with an incident. It's really a multi-tiered approach.
And I'll add to,
please.
If you do get hit, then don't think that's over, because that's, it may be too late for that incident, but it's a great time to think about the next incident, because that's the other thing I've seen happen, kind of in my pre-T-Mobile world where, people are like, oh, okay, we're, we handled that one and we did okay. And they don't go the route of doing those tabletop exercises or anything. I said, no. let's take the learnings from what happened and apply that, because as we were saying earlier, there's a good chance you're going to get hit again, right? So
I had a client who got hit in July and then got hit in February.
not us.
Really bad. Yes, thank goodness.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, that raises a really good point in terms of, you know, getting hit with a cyber incident is sometimes what makes management want to buy into improving an information governance program. But, you know, hopefully you can learn from others' mistakes, right, instead of your own. And so, you know, walking through how do we, you know, as record managers or as counsel, figure out the best way to get buy-in from management, and really starting with what have you heard from management when they push back, you know, against maybe investing more time and resources into building an IG program. And I'll start with Ellen there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I came in-house at first and suddenly realized that, you know, legal and compliance were now a cost center, right? We were not the profit center that we were, you know, that I was when I was with outside counsel. It does change the dynamic, right? I mean, that the business is really focusing on putting money into the company so that they grow the business and they're successful. And so I think that, you know, this is one where helping them understand that there really is a cost, a concrete cost to this, right? It used to be a little bit, you could say, well, you know, if we keep all this data, then the cost downstream for litigation e-discovery is going to be a lot higher, because now we're going to have, you know, that many more documents to go through or collect or all of those things. But this piece, the costs around keeping the data, the sort of cost with complying with the GDPR and CCPA obligations around the, you know, data requests to remove data and things like that. And then with those rules and the fines that are tied specifically to records, it's much easier to quantify, you know, a cost to that. And then there have been so many that you can go back and say, look at the reputational harm, you know, to this. And that really, I think, helps the sort of idea that, you know, this has a direct impact on the business. And even though it's not necessarily growing it in some way, it's helping to not shrink it. And there's definitely a value to that as well.
Absolutely. One of the things that I've seen is going to HR and figuring out how far back their records are, right? Mm-hmm. And then how many former employees were in that time period, right? Because those people, if that information was gone, you don't have to notify them, right? So, and each one of those people is a chance that they're going to file a lawsuit or go to a regulator or talk bad about the company just in general. So that's another way to sort of quantify it for management is to talk about those sorts of things. When we were sort of doing our planning session for this particular call, we were talking about doing tabletop exercises. And I can't remember who it was who said it, but it was brilliant. And it was that what we should add to our tabletop exercise is, okay, you know, server X has been compromised. Go find the oldest document on server X. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and then they get that 1998 document that they're like, oh my God. And I think it sort of drives home, you know, that the scope of the risk.
Yeah, no, I loved that suggestion because it really sort of, I think, may make it concrete. Because as I was saying about kind of the boards for the nonprofits and the, you know, that sometimes there's a disconnect, right? There's, I think, even within legal, right? Or the business making sure that you're like, oh yeah, we're really keeping this data, or, hey, you know, you may think that you've got a system that has data in it that you care about that has to have the retention policy applied to it. And you've got that locked down, right? You've got automatically rolls off after a time. You've had those discussions, that's great. What you may not realize is that that data flows out into 4 or 5 other systems. And maybe the next one, they've had that conversation when they created that link that says, oh, we can only keep this data for 5 years. And so that happens in the next one. But then like 4 or 5 systems later, that conversation may not have happened. It's the old kindergarten game of telephone, right? You never know exactly what's happened there. And so that tabletop exercise of like really digging into pieces of it, and you're never going to, in a tabletop exercise, cover the whole organization. But maybe if you're doing these on a regular enough basis, you get to that, or at least it sparks a conversation so that then you can take that from the tabletop exercise and expand it, out and things like that. So I saw there was a question about, beginning to partner with IT. And I think this is just like setting up calls, right? It's just reaching out to them. I always joke about having an IT spouse, right? It's that person, it's a little more specific than just your work spouse, right? It's that person in IT that you can go to, that you can have those conversations and help them understand why these are issues. And understanding too, not in the time of a crisis, right? Because everybody's feeling stressed, right? When there has been a breach incident and you're asking questions and everybody's defensive and they're up late, you might be running on 20 hours of work, and maybe getting 4 hours of sleep, right? And so tensions are high then. So the earlier you can be involved with, with IT, having a seat at that table, having those discussions, and understanding what their needs are, the better.
Yeah, and to that point, Ellen, it's really important when you're trying to get management buy-in to build a coalition, I'd say, across different units in the business. So there are so many different pieces of a company that have an interest, right, in how the company keeps data. And if you think about, IT, you think about legal. Now with CCPA and GDPR, you have potentially requests coming in from individuals where they're asking, okay, how, can you find my personal information? When I worked at DOJ, we worked with a lot of agencies kind of building coalitions to put forward the business case for, you need to invest in this for a lot of different reasons. It's not just managing cyber risk, which could be have a huge impact on the company, but the way that we manage our data will impact how we can comply with the GDPR or with CCPA. Because if we know where it sits, if we know where the data sits, we can comply with those requests for information, those requests, to delete data or for their, information. Very similar to what's been in the government for a long time with FOIA and Privacy Act requests. So I think that, thinking about managing, getting buy-in from management, building that coalition between the folks that are processing your CCPA and your GDPR requests and IT and legal, if you can get a bunch of groups together and say, we have this one sort of like unifying cause and all of our interests can be served by it, sometimes that even if it will cost more than maybe management would want to invest, if they're satisfying multiple groups in the company, that may in itself be a benefit, for management. So I've seen that, be a very successful model when you all work together and kind of put forward that business case as one.
And I'll add, a lot of times IT wants a reason to say no as well. Like, it's not efficient for them, going back to my 5 conferencing tools example, right? It's not efficient for them to have to support 5 different conferencing tools. They want to be able to say, I only want 2 of them, 3 of them, whatever it is, right? And maybe even just 1, ideally. But they get pushback from the business. And again, IT is kind of more of a cost center than a profit center. And so they don't always have the ability to say no. And if they can come to you as legal and have you say, these are the reasons why this might be a bad idea, then what I found is a lot of times they're really excited to have that support and are willing to bring you in. Again, if you kind of just start establishing those relationships early.
Agreed. Are there any other, and we'll turn it over for questions. Are there any other kind of thoughts on getting management buy-in for building that IG policy or program?
There have been a number of fines. Now, one of them recently just got overturned, but we'll see what happens on appeal. You know, particularly out of the EU, that have been quite significant. You know, in the millions and millions of dollars. In addition, like, so last year or the year before, I think Marriott got fined something like $180, $190 million. Under GDPR, the fine structure for something major is up to 4% of global turnover, annual global turnover, which is revenue, not profits. And when you start quoting numbers like that, I find that people do pay attention. It becomes more of an issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and complying with the GDPR can help you also mitigate risk for cyber because you don't have as much data, right?
Yeah. So somebody asked, to this point, it's not just a legal concern, but often falls on legal to drive. HR, marketing, tax, finance, recruiting should unify. Agree? Yes, absolutely. The more people you can get sort of on board, the better, as far as I'm concerned. Ellen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What question? Does anybody else have questions? We have so thoroughly answered all of your questions.
Or scared everybody.
Yeah, well.
Well, I think that's all we had. Heather, was there any, were there any other announcements?
No, thank you guys for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time and your knowledge and lots of great information, great conversation, and a lot of participation. So we really thank you for that. Just remember to check out arma.org, more information on InfoCon and things in the future. And we will get a copy of the slides and the presentation in the next couple of days. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.